The invasion of Poland in September 1939 stands as one of the most transformative moments in modern history, marking the beginning of the Second World War and the end of the fragile peace that had persisted since 1918. The events surrounding this invasion cannot be viewed in isolation. They were the culmination of 2 decades of political instability, economic hardship, and ideological conflict that reshaped the global order after the First World War. The outbreak of war was not an accident of diplomacy. When the guns of August 1914 fell silent in 1918, Europe lay in ruins. The Treaty of Versailles sought to create a new balance of power, but it also planted the seeds of future conflict. Germany, stripped of its colonies, its army reduced, and burdened with reparations, emerged humiliated and embittered. The war guilt clause, which placed sole responsibility for the war upon Germany and its allies, fostered resentment that would be exploited by extremists. Meanwhile, new states, Poland, Czechoslovakia. The newly reconstituted Polish state was itself a product of the post-war settlement. Having regained independence after more than a century of partition among Russia, Prussia, and Austria, Poland faced the enormous task of unifying its territories and building stable institutions. Its geography, however, made it vulnerable. Sandwiched between Germany and the Soviet Union, Poland's very existence challenged both powers. For Germany, the creation of Poland symbolized national humiliation. For the Soviet Union, it felt as a barrier to its Western ambitions. The interwar years were marked by instability and shifting alliances. The League of Nations, envisioned as the guardian of peace, proved incapable of enforcing its will. The global economic crisis of the 1930s deepened nationalist fervor, while the rise of totalitarian ideologies, fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, and communism in the Soviet Union, polarized international politics. Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1933 fundamentally altered the course of European diplomacy. His promises to overturn. By the late 1930s, the balance of power in Europe had tilted dangerously. Germany's reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936 went unchallenged. The Anschluss of Austria in 1938 further demonstrated the impotence of the Western democracies. The Munich Agreement of the same year, where Britain and France acquiesced to Hitler's demands for the Sudetenland, was celebrated as a triumph of peace. Yet it only emboldened the Nazi regime. When Hitler turned his attention to Poland in 1939, his strategy was clear. Hitler's demands for the return of Danzig, or Gdansk, and the construction of an extraterritorial corridor to East Prussia represented the final step in dismantling the Versailles Order. The Polish government, aware of Germany's intentions but determined to defend its sovereignty, refused. Britain and France, alarmed by the rapid expansion of Nazi power, issued ultimatums demanding that Germany withdraw its forces. Yet their commitment, though sincere, was more moral than practical. Neither nation was prepared for the kind of rapid, mechanized war that Germany would wage. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on August 23, 1939, transformed the geopolitical landscape. The non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the world, for it united 2 ideological enemies in an alliance of convenience. Hidden within the pact's secret protocols was a sinister agreement to divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, Poland being the principal victim. For Hitler, the pact secured his eastern flank. For Stalin, it bought time to rebuild the Soviet military. At dawn on September 1, 1939, German forces launched a massive invasion of Poland. Utilizing the new doctrine of Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, the Wehrmacht combined speed, air power, and mechanized assault to devastating effect. Polish defenses, though brave, crumbled under the weight of German firepower. Within days, cities like Krakow, Lodz, and Warsaw were under siege. The Luftwaffe bombed civilian centers mercilessly, marking the beginning of total warfare in Europe. The world watched in horror as the Polish campaign was not only a military assault, but also a prelude to genocide. Nazi ideology viewed Poles, Jews, and Slavs as inferior races, and the invasion served as a testing ground for policies of occupation and extermination that would later define the Holocaust. Following the Wehrmacht were the Einsatzgruppen, SS death squads tasked with eliminating political leaders, intellectuals, and entire communities. In less than a month, Poland's sovereignty was crushed, and with it, the illusion that aged. On September 17, 1939, as Polish forces fought desperately against the German advance, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. The dual assault sealed Poland's fate. The Red Army claimed to be protecting Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities, but its true purpose was conquest. Within weeks, Poland was partitioned between its two powerful neighbors in accordance with the secret clauses of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The joint victory parades held by German and Soviet troops in places like Brest-Litovsk. The fall of Poland forced Britain and France to act. Bound by treaty obligations, they issued ultimatums demanding that Germany withdraw its forces. When these went unanswered, both declared war on September 3, 1939. Yet, despite their declarations, the Western powers did little to assist their ally. The period that followed, the so-called Phony War, was characterized by inactivity on the Western Front. While Poland burned, the armies of Britain and France remained behind their fortifications, awaiting. The invasion of Poland thus marked the transition from a decade of failed diplomacy to a world engulfed in war. It demonstrated the futility of appeasement and the moral bankruptcy of a system that placed stability above justice. It also revealed the terrifying efficiency of modern warfare, a fusion of technology, ideology, and terror that blurred the line between soldier and civilian. The speed with which Poland was overrun shocked military strategists and changed the course of history. The concept of Blitzkrieg set a new standard for military efficiency and led the Western powers to overestimate German military strength. Globally, the invasion of Poland sent ripples that extended far beyond Europe. In the United States, President Franklin Roosevelt maintained neutrality but began to prepare the nation for the possibility of war. Across the British Empire, dominions such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand rallied to Britain's side, while colonies in Asia and Africa were drawn into the conflict. Japan, already waging its own war in China, viewed the European crisis as an opportunity to expand its influence in the Pacific. The invasion also had profound psychological consequences. It shattered the illusion that the First World War had been the war to end all wars. Once again, millions faced uncertainty, displacement, and fear. The image of German tanks rolling through Polish villages, of civilians fleeing burning cities, became symbols of a new and more total form of war. For Poles, the war did not end with occupation. It marked the beginning of a long struggle for survival, resistance, and eventual liberation. The invasion of Poland and the subsequent global reaction revealed the interconnectedness of nations in the modern age. A conflict that began in Eastern Europe quickly drew in powers from every continent, transforming regional aggression into world war. the failure of international institutions, the complacency of democracies, and the ambitions of dictators combined to create a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. The events of 1939 were both an ending and a beginning, the end of the old European order. In retrospect, the invasion of Poland was inevitable only because the world allowed it to become so. Each act of aggression in the 1930s, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the invasion of Ethiopia, the annexation of Austria, the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, had been met with hesitation or silence. By 1939, the dictators had learned that boldness went unpunished. The price of that lesson would be paid in blood by the people of Poland and eventually by the world. In the shadow of the Great War, Europe stood at a crossroads between fragile peace and impending catastrophe. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, had redrawn the map of Europe but failed to heal the deep wounds inflicted by the First World War. Germany, stripped of its colonies, military strength, and pride, simmered with resentment. The war guilt clause and the crushing reparations imposed upon it by the Allies became the fertile ground upon which nationalism and extremism would grow. In the 1920s and 1930s, the economic collapse of the Great Depression deepened these wounds, leaving millions unemployed and desperate for change. It was in this turbulent soil that Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party found their rise to power. The interwar period was defined by a fragile illusion of stability. The League of Nations, born out of the idealism of President Woodrow Wilson, sought to ensure collective security and prevent future wars. Yet it was a toothless institution, crippled by the absence of the United States and the unwillingness of major powers to enforce its resolutions. Disarmament conferences, non-aggression pacts, and diplomatic agreements masked the rearmament and ambitions of aggressive powers. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had risen to power, promising a revival of Roman glory. In Japan, militarists sought dominance in East Asia. Meanwhile, Britain and France, haunted by the horrors of trench warfare, clung to appeasement, a policy driven as much by fear as by hope. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, few could foresee the scale of destruction he would unleash upon the world. Hitler's vision was not merely political, it was ideological and racial. He sought to overturn the Treaty of Versailles, expand German Lebensraum, living space, to the east, and annihilate what he saw as inferior races, particularly Jews and Slavs. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 marked the first open defiance of Versailles. The world watched but did not act. France, though alarmed, hesitated to move without Britain, and Britain viewed the move as a reasonable step for Germany within its own borders. This lack of response emboldened Hitler further. Europe's next great test came with the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, which served as both a rehearsal for the coming global conflict and a stage for ideological confrontation. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy supported Francisco Franco's nationalists, while the Soviet Union aided the Republican side. Britain and France remained officially neutral, bound by a policy of non-intervention. The Spanish conflict demonstrated not only the brutal effectiveness of German military tactics, notably the bombing of Guernica by the Luftwaffe's Condor Legion, but also the paralysis of the democracies when faced with aggression. The war became a crucible of modern warfare and propaganda, foreshadowing the struggles to come. By 1938, Hitler's ambitions were no longer concealed. His first territorial success came with the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, in March 1938. The event was accomplished with stunning speed and minimal resistance. Crowds in Vienna cheered as German troops entered the city, and the Western democracies, once again, did nothing. Encouraged by this success, Hitler turned next to Czechoslovakia, a democratic state with a strong military and an alliance with France and the Soviet Union. The crisis over the Sudetenland, home to a large ethnic German population, brought Europe to the brink of war. Yet at the Munich Conference in September 1938, British Prime Minister Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier chose appeasement once more. They agreed to Hitler's demands in exchange for his promise of peace. Chamberlain returned to London declaring, "Peace for our time." Within 6 months, Hitler had broken that promise by occupying the rest of Czechoslovakia. The collapse of Munich shattered the illusion that Hitler could be appeased. Britain and France began to rearm and pledged to support Poland against aggression. But it was already too late to prevent war. Hitler's next target was Poland, the state created from the ruins of the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian empires after World War I. He demanded the return of Danzig, Gdansk, and the construction of an extraterritorial corridor connecting East Prussia with the rest of Germany. Poland refused, knowing that acquiescence would mean subjugation. The stage was set for confrontation. While Britain and France sought to strengthen alliances with Eastern European states, Hitler pursued a stunning diplomatic coup. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that stunned the world. The pact secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be partitioned, the Baltic states absorbed, and Finland and Romania placed under Soviet watch. With his eastern flank secured, Hitler was free to attack Poland without fear of Soviet intervention. As August turned to September, Europe stood on the edge of disaster. Hitler's generals prepared for a new kind of war, a lightning war that combined speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. Meanwhile, ordinary Europeans clung to the hope that diplomacy might still avert catastrophe. But in the early hours of September 1, 1939, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. The invasion of Poland had begun. The peace of Europe, already fragile, shattered completely. In retrospect, the road to war was not inevitable, but it was paved with missed opportunities and fatal misjudgments. The failure of the League of Nations, the reluctance of democracies to confront aggression, and the belief that Hitler's ambitions could be contained all contributed to the disaster. The interwar years were a tragic experiment in idealism, undermined by economic depression, political extremism, and the legacy of the Great War. Europe, having failed to secure peace, was now doomed to repeat the horrors it had so desperately tried to forget. The world's descent into war in 1939 was not simply the result of one man's ambition, but of collective failure, a collapse of diplomacy, morality, and courage. The coming conflict would engulf continents, cost tens of millions of lives, and forever alter the course of human history. Europe's long summer of peace was over. The age of total war had returned. In the early dawn of September 1, 1939, Europe awoke to the thunder of war. At precisely 4:45 a.m., the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, anchored in the harbor of Danzig, now Gdansk, opened fire on the Polish military depot at Westerplatte. The bombardment marked the beginning of a new and terrifying era of warfare, one that would come to be known as the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. The German attack on Poland was not a spontaneous act of aggression, but the culmination of months of planning. The Blitzkrieg was a revolutionary concept in military tactics. It relied on speed, coordination, and surprise, combining the destructive power of mechanized infantry, tanks, and aircraft to deliver overwhelming force at a single point. Traditional warfare, defined by trench stalemates and attrition, was replaced by a strategy of rapid penetration and encirclement. Germany's newly formed panzer divisions were the tip of the spear, designed to slice through enemy lines and cause chaos deep in the rear. The attack began simultaneously on multiple fronts. From the north, German troops surged out of East Prussia. From the west, they crossed the Polish-German border. And from the south, the forces stationed in Slovakia moved northward. Within hours, the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, dominated the skies, bombing airfields, communication centers, railways, and cities. Polish defenses, though courageous, were overwhelmed by the scale and coordination of the assault. The Polish Air Force, vastly outnumbered, Warsaw, the heart of Poland, became a symbol of defiance. The city's residents dug trenches, built barricades, and prepared for siege. As German bombers roared overhead, they dropped incendiary and high-explosive bombs, targeting both military and civilian areas. The destruction was catastrophic, yet the Polish people refused to yield. Radio broadcasts called for resistance, and the Polish army fought doggedly despite being outnumbered and outgunned. In the first days of September, Polish cavalry, still the German army advanced with terrifying efficiency. The panzer divisions, supported by motorized infantry, punched through Polish defenses at multiple points, encircling entire units. The Luftwaffe provided relentless air support, striking retreating columns and supply routes. In the Battle of Bzura, Poland's largest counteroffensive, Polish forces launched a bold attack against German units near Luch. For a brief moment they achieved success, pushing back the invaders, but German air superiority and behind the front lines, the war took on a darker, more sinister character. Following the Wehrmacht were the Einsatzgruppen, special SS units tasked with eliminating political opponents, Jews, and members of the Polish intelligentsia. The invasion was not only a military conquest, but also the beginning of a campaign of racial and political terror. Nazi ideology framed the war in Poland as a struggle for survival and expansion of the Aryan race. Villages were burned, civilians executed, and entire communication. As the German forces advanced deeper into Poland, the international community watched in horror. Britain and France, having guaranteed Poland's independence, issued ultimatums demanding the withdrawal of German troops. Hitler, confident in his belief that the Western powers would once again back down, ignored them. Meanwhile, in the skies above Poland, the Luftwaffe demonstrated the future of modern warfare. Dive bombers, especially the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, terrorized defenders with their precision bombs. The Polish army, despite its bravery, faced overwhelming odds. Its mobilization had been delayed by political hesitation, and many units were still assembling when the invasion began. Communications broke down under the intensity of German bombing, and supply lines were severed. The use of radio coordination by the Germans contrasted sharply with the Polish reliance on couriers and telephone lines, which were easily destroyed. The Polish soldiers fought valiantly in places like Westerplatte, Wisna, and Bzura. By mid-September, the situation was dire. The German army had captured major cities, including Krakow, and encircled the Polish capital. The government fled Warsaw, moving eastward in hopes of regrouping or escaping into Romania. Refugees clogged the roads, and entire towns were reduced to rubble. The sense of betrayal grew among the Polish populace as they waited in vain for the promised Western offensive. The so-called phony war on the Western Front, marked by British and French inaction, became a symbol of betrayal. Hitler's speeches to his generals revealed his sense of destiny. He saw the war in Poland as the first step toward reshaping Europe under German rule. The Wehrmacht, flushed with victory, believed in its invincibility. Yet even in these early days there were signs of brutality that foreshadowed the horrors to come. German soldiers, encouraged by propaganda portraying Poles as subhuman, participated in atrocities against civilians. Jewish communities, already segregated by Nazi racial laws, faced systematic persecution and displacement. The fall of Warsaw in late September marked the end of organized Polish resistance. The city, subjected to relentless bombardment, finally surrendered on September 27 after suffering immense casualties and destruction. Over 20,000 civilians were killed, and vast sections of the capital were destroyed. On October 6, 1939, the last major Polish units capitulated, and the campaign was declared over. In just over 5 weeks, Poland had been crushed by the might of Nazi Germany. Yet the nation's spirit endured. The German victory in Poland stunned the world. The Blitzkrieg had proven devastatingly effective, rewriting the rules of warfare. Speed, coordination, and technology had triumphed over courage and tradition. Military strategists across Europe and beyond studied the campaign with awe and dread. But behind the apparent triumph lay the seeds of future catastrophe. Hitler's success emboldened him to challenge the rest of Europe, while the brutality of occupation revealed the genocidal nature of his regime. For Poland, the invasion was only the beginning of a long nightmare. The country would be divided, its people subjected to occupation, persecution, and resistance. The world, too, would soon feel the consequences of those first gunshots fired at Westerplatte. The invasion of Poland was not just the start of a war, it was the end of an era. The age of peace and diplomacy had given way to the age of total war. While the world's eyes were fixed on the westward advance of German armies, a second, equally devastating blow was preparing to strike from the east. On September 17, 1939, less than 3 weeks after the German invasion began, Soviet forces crossed the Polish border. The assault was not spontaneous or defensive. It was the execution of a secret agreement signed between Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin in August, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. When the Red Army invaded, Poland's government was already in chaos. German forces had overrun most of the western and central regions, and the remnants of the Polish military were retreating toward the Romanian border in the hope of regrouping or escaping. The Soviet invasion shattered those hopes. Stalin's forces entered Poland under the pretense of protecting Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities. The Soviet ambassador in Warsaw delivered a cynical note declaring that the Polish state had ceased to exist. The scale of the Soviet invasion was immense. Over 800,000 troops, supported by 4,700 tanks and 3,000 aircraft, poured across the eastern frontier. The Polish army, already weakened by 3 weeks of brutal fighting, could offer only scattered resistance. Units stationed in the east were stunned. Many had no knowledge of the secret German-Soviet agreement and could not comprehend why a supposed neutral neighbor had attacked them. In cities like Lviv, now Lviv, Grodno, and Vilnius, the Soviet advance was methodical and merciless. Towns were bombed, bridges destroyed, and resistance crushed. Yet in many places, the encounter between Soviet and German troops was disturbingly cordial. On September 22, 1939, a joint military parade took place in the city of Brest-Litovsk, where German and Soviet officers saluted each other as allies. The two totalitarian regimes, ideologically opposed but strategically aligned, had succeeded in dismantling an entire nation in less than a month. The human cost of the dual invasion was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Polish soldiers and civilians were captured and imprisoned by the Soviets. Officers, politicians, priests, and intellectuals were singled out as enemies of the people. Thousands were executed in secret or sent to the Gulag system in Siberia. The Katyn Forest Massacre, which would later be revealed in 1943, saw over 22,000 Polish officers and intelligentsia murdered by the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. The massacre symbolized the dismemberment of Poland was formalized on September 28, 1939, when Germany and the Soviet Union signed the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty. The new border ran roughly along the Bug River, dividing Poland into German and Soviet zones of occupation. In the west, Poland was absorbed into the Reich as part of Hitler's plan for Germanization. In the east, the Soviets annexed the territories into the Ukrainian and Belarusian Soviet republics. Millions of Poles found themselves suddenly living under Soviet occupation. Life became a nightmare of repression. The NKVD swiftly established control, arresting anyone suspected of anti-Soviet sentiment. Families were deported en masse to remote regions of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Siberia, and beyond. Property was confiscated, schools restructured, and the Polish language suppressed. Oxidor and communist propaganda flooded the newly occupied territories, promising liberation but delivering tyranny. For many Ukrainians and Belarusians, meanwhile, in the German-occupied zone, the Nazi regime began implementing its own vision for Poland's future. The general government, established under Hans Frank, became a laboratory for Nazi racial and administrative policies. Jews were confined to ghettos, Polish elites were executed or imprisoned, and the systematic destruction of Polish culture began. Libraries were burned, universities closed, and the clergy persecuted. The dual occupation created a nightmare scenario, two oppressive regimes inflicting suffering on the Polish people. The collapse of Poland marked a turning point in world history. For the first time since World War I, two great powers had colluded to erase a sovereign nation from the map of Europe. The notion of collective security, so carefully cultivated after 1919, was exposed as hollow. The League of Nations, already weakened, stood paralyzed. Western democracies, though now technically at war with Germany, could do nothing to assist Poland. The promised aid from Britain and France never materialized. Polish hopes of independence were crushed, but their spirit was not broken. Yet, amid the ruins, the Polish spirit endured. Thousands of soldiers and civilians escaped through Romania and Hungary, eventually reaching France and Britain. There, the Polish government in exile was established, continuing the struggle for independence. Polish pilots, sailors, and soldiers would later distinguish themselves in battles across Europe, from the skies of Britain to the beaches of Normandy. The fall of their homeland did not extinguish their resolve, it only strengthened it. The Soviet invasion of Poland revealed the ruthlessness of Stalin's ambitions and his willingness to cooperate, temporarily, with fascist Germany. Both dictators saw Poland as expendable, a pawn in their larger geopolitical game. Yet the seeds of future conflict between the two powers were already being sown. Mutual distrust lingered beneath their facade of friendship. The German-Soviet alliance, founded on convenience rather than conviction, would not survive long. Less than 2 years later, in June 1941, when German troops crossed the Polish frontier on September 1, 1939, the political leadership in Britain and France faced the greatest moral and strategic test of their generation. For years, they had sought to contain Hitler through diplomacy, appeasement, and cautious rearmament. Yet the invasion of Poland exposed the failure of these policies. The guarantees given to Warsaw earlier that year left the Western democracies with no room for retreat. The era of compromise was over. In London, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, the man most associated with appeasement, was a haunted figure. Only a year earlier, he had returned from Munich proclaiming peace for our time, believing that concessions to Hitler could preserve stability in Europe. Now that illusion lay in ruins. On September 1, Chamberlain convened his cabinet and emergency sessions of Parliament. Reports poured in from the British Embassy in Warsaw and from air reconnaissance. The German invasion was total, brutal. The British government acted with deliberation, but also with hesitation. Memories of the slaughter of the First World War still haunted the nation. Many feared another catastrophic conflict that could destroy civilization itself. Yet the public mood hardened as news of the German atrocities in Poland spread. Crowds gathered outside Downing Street and Buckingham Palace, demanding action. The press, once divided, now called for firm resistance. Chamberlain's political survival, and France, Britain's ally, faced its own crisis of conscience. The French army, though formidable on paper, was cautious and defensive in spirit. The trauma of 1914 to 1918 had left deep scars. The Maginot Line, an enormous series of fortifications along the German border, symbolized both France's military strength and its psychological paralysis. French leaders, including Premier Edgar Daladier and General Maurice Gamelin, were reluctant to commit to an offensive action without British coordination. On September 2, both Britain and France sent formal ultimatums to Berlin, demanding an immediate withdrawal of German forces from Poland. Hitler, confident that the Western powers would not act, ignored them. He believed that the democracies lacked the will for war, just as they had during the remilitarization of the Rhineland and the annexation of Czechoslovakia. He miscalculated. At 11 a.m. on September 3, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. Chamberlain's voice, solemn and heavy with regret, echoed Ach. 2 days later, France followed suit. At 5 p.m. on September 3, Daladier announced to a hushed nation that France, too, was now at war with Germany. Bells rang across Paris, and crowds filled the boulevards, chanting, "Vive la France!" But beneath the surface, anxiety prevailed. The French army mobilized, but there was no immediate offensive. Instead, a strange calm settled over the Western Front, a lull that would later be known as the drôle de guerre, or phony war. Soldiers manned trenches. The early months of the war were marked by contradiction. Britain and France were technically at war, yet no major battles were fought in the West. The Allied high commands believed that time was on their side, that economic blockade and rearmament would eventually bring Germany to its knees. Meanwhile, the Polish army was fighting for its life. Appeals for immediate relief went unanswered. Allied troops waited behind their defenses, and aerial bombing of Germany. Despite the inaction on land, the war at sea began immediately. The Royal Navy instituted a blockade of German ports, cutting off vital imports of food and raw materials. The German Kriegsmarine retaliated with U-boat attacks, seeking to starve Britain into submission. On September 3, the same day Britain declared war, the passenger liner Athenia was torpedoed by a German submarine, killing over 100 civilians, including Americans. The sinking shocked the world and foreshadowed the brutal nature. In the skies, Britain's Royal Air Force conducted its first missions, dropping propaganda leaflets over German cities, a symbolic gesture of defiance rather than destruction. Chamberlain's government, still reluctant to initiate full-scale bombing, clung to the hope that negotiations might still avert a wider catastrophe. But Hitler's relentless aggression made that impossible. Within weeks, Germany signed new alliances with Italy, and the Soviet Union solidified its control over eastern Poland. On the home front, Britain prepared for the long haul. Air raid sirens were installed, blackouts enforced, and gas masks distributed to millions. The evacuation of children from London and other major cities began, an operation that would define the wartime experience of an entire generation. The government established the Ministry of Information to control news and propaganda, ensuring that morale remained high. The slogan, "Keep calm and carry on," printed in secret in 1939. France, too, mobilized its society for total war. Factories shifted production to arms and munitions, while the population braced for a conflict that most feared but few understood. The memory of the German occupation in 1870 and the trenches of 1914 lingered in the national consciousness. Yet even as the French soldiers manned the Maginot Line, a sense of unreality persisted. Many believed that the war would remain confined to Poland and that diplomacy might still find a way out. Politically, the declaration of war transformed Europe overnight. Hitler, once the master of bluff, now faced the combined might of the Western democracies. Mussolini, wary of entering a conflict for which Italy was unprepared, declared neutrality, for the time being. Stalin, secure in his pact with Germany, bided his time and consolidated his territorial gains. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the American public, declaring the United States neutral but urging support for the victory. For Chamberlain, the transition from appeasement to war leadership was agonizing. He knew that his policy of negotiation had failed, yet he believed he had bought valuable time for Britain to rearm. Still, the early months of the war exposed the limitations of his leadership. In Parliament, voices like Winston Churchill and Anthony Eden, long critical of appeasement, gained prominence. Churchill, now First Lord of the Admiralty, returned to government with characteristic energy and determination. The phony war period that followed from late 1939 to spring 1940 was deceptive. On the surface, Europe seemed suspended between peace and total war. Newspapers carried reports of troop movements and diplomatic maneuvers, but for most civilians, life continued with uneasy normalcy. But beneath the calm, the great powers were preparing for the next phase. German industry worked at fever pitch to expand armaments, while Allied planners debated strategy. Should they attack, defend? For the people of Poland, these debates came too late. As Britain and France declared war but failed to intervene effectively, Poland was left to fight alone. The fall of Warsaw and the Soviet invasion sealed its fate. The Western democracies, though now officially combatants, had failed their first ally. The moral weight of that failure would haunt them throughout the war. Churchill would later write, "It was the beginning of the reckoning." The thunder of German guns in Poland and the subsequent declarations of war by Britain and France sent shockwaves across the globe. For the first time in 20 years, the world faced the grim prospect of another general conflict, one that many feared would surpass the horrors of the First World War. From Washington to Tokyo, from London to Buenos Aires, leaders, diplomats, and ordinary citizens tried to comprehend the magnitude of what had begun. The invasion of Poland was not merely a European affair. It raised questions about international law, collective security, and the future of civilization itself. The United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, addressed the nation with solemn restraint. America, he insisted, would remain neutral. But no one can fail to see that the very foundations of civilization are being shaken. The American public, scarred by the losses of the previous war and disillusioned by the Great Depression, overwhelmingly supported neutrality. The Neutrality Acts of the 1930s had been designed to prevent the nation from being drawn into another foreign entanglement. In Latin America, the reaction was mixed but deeply concerned. Many nations, including Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, declared neutrality, though public opinion was divided between sympathy for the Allies and admiration for Germany's military prowess. The Pan American Conference, held shortly after the outbreak of war, reaffirmed the commitment of the Western Hemisphere to non-intervention and collective defense. The concept of hemispheric solidarity, championed by Roosevelt's Good Neighbor policy, took on new urgency. Across the British Empire, the declaration of war in London automatically extended to its dominions and colonies, though each responded in its own way. In Canada, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King convened Parliament and, after a week of debate, formally declared war on September 10, 1939. The decision underscored Canada's growing independence within the Commonwealth. Australia and New Zealand followed suit almost immediately, pledging full support to Britain. In South Africa, however, in the vast territories of India, the outbreak of war stirred both loyalty and resentment. The British government's unilateral decision to involve India in the conflict without consulting its elected leaders provoked outrage among nationalists. The Indian National Congress, led by Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi, demanded that Britain clarify its war aims and grant self-government as a condition for support. When their demands were ignored, Congress ministries resigned in protest. In Asia, Japan watched the European crisis with both alarm and opportunity. The Japanese leadership, already engaged in a brutal war in China since 1937, saw the conflict in Europe as a chance to expand its influence in the Pacific. Tokyo declared neutrality but began to position itself strategically for future gains. The fall of Poland and the preoccupation of the Western powers emboldened Japanese militarists, who saw a distracted Europe as an open door for imperial expansion. The seeds of future confusion in the Pacific were already being sown. In the Soviet Union, the reaction was triumphalist and pragmatic. Stalin's regime portrayed the invasion of eastern Poland as a liberation of oppressed peoples, though few believed the propaganda. Soviet newspapers published images of Red Army soldiers fraternizing with local populations while concealing the mass arrests and deportations that followed. Privately, Stalin viewed the outbreak of war in the West as a golden opportunity. With Germany and the Western Allies locked in conflict, the USSR could expand its territory and influence in Eastern Europe without fear of immediate fightback. Elsewhere in Europe, the reactions varied according to circumstance and fear. In Italy, Benito Mussolini declared that his country would remain non-belligerent, unwilling to enter the war until it was clear which side would prevail. Though bound to Germany by the Pact of Steel, Mussolini's regime was militarily unprepared and economically fragile. In Spain, still recovering from civil war, General Francisco Franco proclaimed neutrality while offering moral support to Hitler. Switzerland, Sweden, and Ireland maintained their neutrality, yet their economies faced new challenges as they navigated the treacherous waters of European conflict. In the Middle East, the outbreak of war stirred complex emotions. British and French mandates in the region, such as Iraq, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon, became strategic assets. Arab leaders, resentful of colonial rule yet wary of fascism, watched events closely. In Palestine, tensions between Jewish and Arab communities intensified as Zionist groups prepared to support the Allied cause, hoping that victory would bring a homeland closer to reality. The Jewish Agency in Jerusalem declared full support Africa. Colonial subjects were drawn once again into a European conflict not of their making. Britain and France mobilized troops from their African colonies, recruiting soldiers from Nigeria, Kenya, Senegal, and beyond. Many fought bravely in campaigns that lay ahead, though few yet grasped the scale of the coming struggle. Propaganda emphasized loyalty to the empire and the fight for freedom, but for many Africans, the conflict seemed another example of European exploitation. The global economy, still fragile after the Great Depression, faced new turmoil. Trade routes were disrupted, shipping endangered by submarines, and markets destabilized by uncertainty. Yet in the United States, the defense industries began to stir. Orders for war materials from Britain and France revived production and employment. The so-called arsenal of democracy had not yet been proclaimed, but the machinery of war was already turning. Economists and industrialists foresaw both danger and opportunity. The world's press captured the unfolding drama with a mixture of awe and dread. Newspapers in New York, Paris, and London carried maps of Poland covered with arrows and shaded regions. Headlines screamed of bombings, invasions, and ultimatums. In neutral capitals, Stockholm, Dublin, Lisbon, journalists speculated on the next moves of Hitler and Stalin. In Rome and Berlin, state-controlled media justified aggression as a defense against Western imperialism. Propaganda became a weapon as potent as any bomb. At the Vatican, Pope Pius XII issued an appeal for peace, lamenting that the nations have been plunged once more into the abyss of war. His words, however sincere, went unheeded. The Pope's cautious diplomacy reflected the Church's fear of both communism and Nazism, but his silence on specific atrocities would later draw criticism. Religion, like politics, struggled to find moral clarity in a world descending into barbarism. In the Far East, China found a momentary respite as global attention shifted to Europe. Chiang Kai-shek's government sought to exploit the situation by appealing for Western aid against Japan. Yet the Allies, now consumed by their own survival, offered little beyond words. Meanwhile, the Japanese Imperial Army continued its brutal campaign in China, culminating in atrocities such as the bombing of Chongqing. The Second World War, though centered in Europe, was already global in its implications. By late 1939, the full geopolitical consequences of the invasion of Poland were becoming clear. The balance of power that had sustained the interwar order was shattered. The League of Nations, exposed as impotent, drifted into irrelevance. The smaller nations of Europe, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, scrambled to declare neutrality, hoping to avoid Poland's fate. Yet the lessons of 1939 suggested that neutrality offered no guarantee of safety in a world dominated by totalitarian ambition. In Washington, Roosevelt moved cautiously but decisively to prepare the United States for the possibility of involvement. Congress revised the Neutrality Act to permit cash-and-carry sales of weapons to the Allies. The move, though limited, marked a significant step away from isolationism. The American president understood that the defense of democracy in Europe was inseparable from the security of the Western Hemisphere. When peace has been broken anywhere, Roosevelt warned, the peace of all countries is in danger. As winter approached in 1939, the world entered a tense and uncertain phase. The guns in Poland fell silent, but the reverberations echoed across continents. Millions of people, from London to Leningrad, from New York to Nanking, sensed that a new and terrible era had begun. The Second World War was no longer a distant storm. It was the defining reality of the 20th century. The invasion of Poland had set in motion forces that would reshape nations, ideologies, and the very concept of humanity itself.